Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Climate Confident Podcast. My name is Tom Raftery, and with me on the show today, I've got my special guest, John. John, welcome to the podcast. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks very much, Tom. So my name is John Lang. I founded something called the Net Zero Tracker back in 2019 with my former boss, Richard Black. And the Net Zero Tracker is an accountability and transparency tool, and we'll get into that in further detail in a little bit. But I specialize in analysis and explaining climate change, science, and policy to the public. I became very passionate about explaining climate change because I had a lukewarm politician stepfather back in New Zealand. So I thought I'd do my due diligence on this issue, on the climate issue. And then I became a prisoner of what I knew. And I started to know too much about it to go in a different direction from a career perspective. Another tidbit about myself is I founded Kiwis in Climate, which is a 500 strong group of New Zealanders working in climate and sustainability related fields around the world. That sprung out of London, but is now an international initiative.
Okay, and you head up the Net Zero Tracker as part of the ECIU, which, if I can remember correctly, is Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit. Can you talk to us a little bit about what that is and how it works?
Yeah, sure. No, so that's correct. We actually stole the name from the Economist Intelligence Unit, I believe. It's it's a rather pretentious name, as our then boss Richard Black said. But yeah, so the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit, we're a bunch of analysts and communicators, and we were founded back in 2014. So we're approaching our 10-year anniversary, and we were founded to try and clean up the misinformation landscape in the UK media landscape. So the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit, or ECIU, have had a huge effect in the UK by bringing accountability to what people say in opinion pieces and also in articles, especially on the right side of the aisle, where the conversation actually needs to be won. It doesn't need to be one on the left side of the aisle, it needs to be one on the right side of the aisle. And ECIU was founded to try and make sure that there is informed debate on climate change and energy, especially on the right side of that aisle.
Okay, and what would you say has surprised you the most in your journey from your, starting out looking into climate, you know, your lukewarm politician stepdad to where you are today leading the net zero tracker for ECIU?
Yeah, I'll say a couple of things. First, their personal thing. I think the most surprising element is actually the more you understand about climate change, the less scared of it you are, because you actually understand you understand the intractability of the problem, the enormous challenge that it's going to be. But you also meet all the amazing people that are working on it, and you also see that the progress is real at the policy level, at the clean energy level, at the communications level, at the activism level, and actually that fills you with hope. So I often say to people who feel fraudulent talking about climate change, I just say to them, well, actually learn more about it, and I think you'll feel it'll be liberating, and you'll feel more comfortable about speaking about it, and actually more positive about the direction that humanity's going in terms of tackling the issue. So that's kind of the personal surprise. The professional surprise was probably relating to the speed at which countries, companies, subnational governments, so by subnational governments, I mean regions and cities, have taken up this concept of net zero. Net zero was a scientific concept that was, I think, first tabled in 2008 by Miles Allen and a fellow Kiwi, Dave Frame. And to go from 2008 to being a new scientific principle to being part of the policy landscape through the Paris Agreement in 2015, and then hit the actual mainstream around 2018 in the wake of Greta Thunberg inspired climate consciousness and the IPCC's, I should say, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's special report on 1.5 degrees. That was an unbelievable surprise. When I joined the ECIU, I'd never heard of net zero.
Mm.
And then as soon as I joined, about 6 months later, I created a little infographic and a small database on what countries and big companies were doing on net zero. And suddenly that snowballed and went viral on climate Twitter. We were approached by Oxford University and two other international organizations, one in the US and one in Germany, and we formed the Net Zero Tracker. And little did we know that we would see the amount of GDP covered by net zero increasing from, I think, 18% to 92% in the space of about 24 months. So that was unbelievably surprising from my perspective. It almost went too quickly, but we can dive into those details because the policy world, the standards world, had a really difficult time of keeping up with that proliferation of net zero targets. But yeah, let's leave those details for a bit little later because that kind of gets to the lack of integrity and the confusion around net zero more generally.
Okay. So for people who are listening who might not be aware, just give me a little bit more detail. I mean, we can guess from the name, but give me a little bit more detail of what the Net Zero Tracker is and does.
Yeah, sure. Firstly, a lot of people get confused by as soon as you say tracker because we're often conflated with carbon tracker, climate action tracker, a whole bunch of other trackers.
Mm.
But yes, as you say, it's an intuitive name, the net zero tracker. So what are we? We're essentially an accountability and transparency tool for looking at what, well, every country, big companies, the largest regions in the world. So we look at all regions in the 25 largest emitting nations in the world and every city with over 500,000 people. So in total, the net zero tracker looks at over 4,000 entities. Earlier this year, we also added the 100 biggest private firms in the world because for us, that was a bit of a black hole. So at the tracker, we have to balance breadth with depth. And at the moment, we've had a real bias for breadth rather than depth. And now we have been criticized for that, but it is mainly a resourcing problem. We can't look more deeply into some of these targets. And our friends and partners at the New Climate Institute, they do these deep dives every year. So they complement our work. Sometimes what I say is thin scrutinizing. But so just to dive into a little bit more detail on the tracker. So at the heart of the tracker is a small army of Oxford University students that actually collect the data manually. So as you won't be surprised to hear, Tom, and many of the folks listening in, there's a lot of reporting holes out there and there's very little standardization across that reporting landscape. And so what we've tried to do is we've tried to create the most comprehensive, credible, consistent, and current database in the world using manual data collection, looking at publicly available documents and trying to standardize that in the first instance. And so that's a huge, it's a monumental effort. But I just want to say a big thanks to actually if some of those volunteers may be listening. I think we've had about 500 go through the system, and I think we have about 200 in the system at the moment. Those volunteers are mainly at the University of Oxford, but we've expanded that cohort to other universities around the world as well. What else to just bring the tracker to light? So I mentioned 4 organizations. I think I've name dropped Oxford University. I've name dropped New Climate Institute. Another one that's worth mentioning is the Data Driven EnviroLab, where we want to go with this, because I don't think we're going to have standardized reporting around the world anytime soon, probably not until the 2030s. I think we'll get there, but we're not quite there yet. So we are going to need this call of volunteers doing what they do best. But we'd love to make the user experience better by integrating ChatGPT infrastructure, trying to be at the vanguard of web scraping, and also AI to try and make the life easier for these volunteers and also make the data even more credible than it is today. So I think that brings the tracker to light a little bit. The other thing I should mention is that what we're trying to do is we're trying to alleviate confusion. I think about net zero from this perspective. Net zero suffers from a deficit of credibility and a surplus of confusion. And so what we try and do is we try and alleviate that confusion. And we see that actually as a prerequisite for trying to tackle the deficit of credibility around these net zero targets that have been set by, I think, over 1,500 entities that we track today. For me, that's a really big one. I said earlier that I love to explain climate change science and policy to the public because it is so enormously complex. And so one thing the tracker we do try and do is break things down to make it really simple so that people can actually understand net zero in the first instance.
So is it the case that you're saying, okay, this particular entity, be it a government, be it a company, have said they're going to get to net zero by X date, but looking at their data, they're only X% into it, and so the chance of them getting it by date Y are negligible or fantastic or somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, exactly. So what we do is we look at the intent and the integrity of net zero targets. We don't look at the implementation. And of course, people say, well, you need to be looking at if they're actually reducing emissions. Yes, of course, we do need to be doing that, but we're trying to get our house in order first. And what we're looking at these entities to see if they've got their houses in order. So yes, we ask that first question, do they have a net zero target? But then we dive into the important details, and this is the bread and butter of the net zero tracker. So we look at things like, do they have a plan? And is that plan complete? Are they being transparent around the use of offsets or carbon credits? Often, one of the findings we find time and time again is that they're not being transparent. These companies are not telling us what they're going to do around offsets. And that undermines their whole strategy to get to net zero. Other things like progress reporting, companies, other entities reporting on progress annually. Are they covering all greenhouse gases? So not just CO2, but also methane and nitrous oxide. If you're a company, are they covering scope 3 emissions? So that's hugely important. And we have seen growth in that area, which has been one of the few positives that we have consistently found. Another element is there accountability at the company at the board level for hitting some of these targets? So we look at a range of integrity criteria, which we borrowed from the UN expert group on net zero targets, and also the Race to Zero campaign. So they're both UN orchestration initiatives. We don't try to reinvent the wheel. We actually look at those standards that are emerging out there, and we apply them to our over 4,000 entities. So we ask very simple questions. Each year we produce a report called Net Zero Stocktake. And what we found is we found growth at the intent level. So there are more and more companies, cities and regions setting net zero targets. Companies have increased by 23% in the last 18 months. Regions have increased by about 28% in the last 18 months. So, that's great progress on intent. But when we look at integrity, the standards that we use, we call them minimum procedural requirements. We just want to know, are these entities, are these companies in these regions, are they doing the minimum procedural requirements? And what we consistently find is that very few are doing that. So about 1 in 20 across all entity groups are actually hitting all minimum procedural requirements. So we look at about 7 or 8 criteria. So a lot of entities are doing 4 or 5 of those, but they're not doing all 8. And we actually see all 8 as integral to being able to claim that you have a robust net zero target.
Right. We're hearing more. You talked about earlier about subnational governments and their role in climate action. Can you tell us why cities, states, and regions are so critical to achieving net zero targets and what's holding them back if they're, as you mentioned, not hitting all their targets?
Yeah, sure. Happy to. Often there's a focus on those charismatic countries and charismatic companies that we always see in the news. And so this year we decided to have a special focus on subnationals. And so by subnational governments, I mean both regional governments and city governments. We see the importance of these entities. I mean, they are the real world actors. And with the prospect of a potential Donald Trump second administration, these subnational actors are going to potentially become even more important over time. But there are two main reasons why we concentrate our efforts on looking at subnationals. And they're summed up in 2 phrases. So vertical governance, that's a really important term. And another term is the ambition loop. So vertical governance, it kind of says what it is on the tin. So are subnational governments lining up with targets and strategies at the national level? And then getting to the ambition loop side of the equation, are they influencing what's happening at the national level? Or vice versa. So what national governments are doing around policies, around targeting, around strategies, having an influence at the subnational level and indeed at the company level. That's why it's so important to look at the whole chain rather than concentrating, say, just on companies or just on countries. And that's one of the founding principles of the Net Zero Tracker, because we wanted to look at the whole of the economy and what the whole of the economy were trying to do around net zero. Just to bring the ambition loop to life a little bit more, I often define it as the bidirectional relationship between different levels of governance. And there is emerging evidence that actually there is an ambition loop. And sometimes I think about like a sandwich, so how do you actually get action? You need to get groundswell, and you also need the kind of top down stuff. And in some locations we are seeing that, which is great. So what we did find in this recent stock take is that national targets often serve as a ceiling to climate ambition at the city and regional level. But that's in some countries, some national governments do go above and beyond. So, for example, in Germany, in India, in Australia, we have seen regions actually pushing further and going beyond what the national government has said. And in some cases, I think in the case of Australia, Japan, and Mexico, you've actually seen a case where some national actors setting targets and setting robust strategies and increase ambition, which in turn hopefully increases action. So there's a lot that some national actors can do, and they are at the very forefront or at the tip of the turbine of net zero.
You mentioned that a lot of the companies and cities, a significant proportion of them, still lack integrity. How do we bridge that gap between ambition and action, and what's been the biggest barrier in improving the quality of these commitments?
I'll start in reverse order because I spoke about confusion. I genuinely think the surplus of confusion is a massive impediment to these entities actually improving integrity.
Okay.
And by confusion, I mean basically if you've got a lot of different standards. So say you've got 10 different standards trying to achieve the same thing, but all saying slightly different things. That gives opportunities to entities, especially companies, to hide behind the least credible, the lowest common denominator, that least credible standard. So that's, I think, what we've seen. And so one of the hugely important elements around our ecosystem, around the accountability ecosystem, is to try and converge around what good net zero looks like. And so for me, that's hugely important. And so we are seeing convergence. We are seeing, for example, the International Sustainability Standards Board, ISSB, have just brought out their disclosure standards. That's been taken up by 20 plus countries already, or promised to be. And you've also got the net zero standard, which has been developed by ISO, so the International Organization for Standardization. If we can get that convergence, I think there's going to be fewer places for these entities to hide. Another element of the lack of integrity is that there is a disparity between the resources of, say, a S&P 500 company versus a city in Mongolia or a city in Kazakhstan. So that's an interesting area that demands a lot more research, and it is a sensitive subject because it's important that you get those equity and sectoral dimensions right. We shouldn't carry too large a hammer on the integrity aspects, but what we should be seeing across all entities is improvements. So some entities may start at a lower place, but we do need to see all those trends increasing. If we get increased integrity, we think that we're going to start to see actual implementation. Again, by implementation, I mean emission reductions.
Great. And you mentioned that over 40% of subnational governments still have no mitigation targets. Why? Why do you think so many major actors are still sitting on the sidelines? And what can national governments do to nudge them towards ambitious climate goals?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I wish I knew the answer. And it's not just subnational regions and companies; it's also countries. So I mentioned that 92% of GDP is covered in a net zero target, but that still leaves about 50 nations that haven't got a net zero target. And we're not asking for much. We're not asking for a net zero target of 2050. We just would love to know if a country has a net zero target this century. That would be great. If it was 2090, we still got to put it on in our database. What can national governments do? Now, there is talk of countries mandating transition strategies from both regions and from companies. In the EU, for example, you have got the corporate sustainability standards
Due
directive.
diligence directive?
That's the one. Yeah. CS triple D. Yeah. So, that's going to mandate transition plans from companies, not just large companies in the EU, but also large companies outside of the EU that have big supply chains in the EU, or at least want to sell into the EU. So, and you're obviously familiar with that, Tom. So we are seeing progress on that front, but we do need those extraterritorial dimensions that are coming out of the EU to be taken up by other jurisdictions. So yes, we've got about 40% of actors that need to set net zero targets. We often talk about net zeros. We need more, but most importantly, we need better.
We've heard some talk as well around spheres of influence beyond the company's direct value chain. Can you explain what that means in practical terms and how leading companies can use this concept to genuinely make a difference?
Yeah, it's essentially sum it up with, don't lobby against climate action, lobby for it. And I often compare it to individual behavioral change, because we know that there's a dichotomy between individual behavioral change and political change or systemic change. And I think it's the same concept at the actual entity level. So at the Net Zero Tracker, we look at what companies are doing inside the value chain. Do they have targets? Are they covering all emissions? But this spheres of influence concept, and actually looks at what a company is trying to do outside of the value chain or beyond the value chain. You might be familiar with the new term beyond value chain mitigation. So that's starting to rise up the ranks in the climate ecosystem. And so it's getting to the point that what are businesses doing? Are they diversifying their business models that are going to be fit for a net zero world, for example? Are they aligning on policy? And as I said before, are they making sure that they're not lobbying against climate action, but for it? And not just directly, but also indirectly through their trade memberships and their industry associations. So that's a huge part of it. And we've got a great partner, Influence Map. We auto feed their data into the Net Zero Tracker portal. And they actually look at these questions around kind of spheres of influence, lobbying, policy advocacy, and alignment. And that's hugely important. I would say that's the most important thing that a company can be doing, is aligning these spheres of influence with the net zero transition. Yes, they need their own house in order, but they need to be contributing to systemic change. Just as an individual needs to be thinking about systemic political change rather than just individual behavioral change.
I have a particular interest in the automotive sector, for example, because I'm a big fan of EVs. And we can see in the automotive sector the likes of Toyota, who are lobbying against emissions legislation for vehicles, increasingly tightening the legislation. They want to be allowed to continue polluting. You can put that up against other manufacturers, the likes of Volvo Group or Volkswagen, who are going the opposite direction and lobbying for increased legislation on emissions for vehicles. That's roughly what you're talking about, right? But broader.
That's exactly right. And I made the mistake. We actually had a representative of Volvo Group at our net zero stocktake launch a couple of weeks ago. And I mixed up Volvo Group with Volvo Cars. Little did I know, because I knew that Volvo Cars had just done a retreat from one of their targets. And I accused Karen of being part of that. But of course, she was with the Volvo Group, and she was like, no. We go to the opposite direction. We're doing all the right things. So that was good to hear. So yes, it's exactly right. You've got other leaders that Influence Map has profiled and surfaced. And again, that's also a really important part of this. We need to be profiling those companies that are actually using their spheres of influence to change the systemic landscape. One of the things we are guilty of at the Net Zero Tracker is we concentrate on those with net zero targets, not necessarily those without them, because like I was saying, our bread and butter is looking at the integrity of net zero targets. So by definition, we're not looking at those without targets. So one of the things to counter that is to profile those leaders, because you don't want to be just banging a stick on those that are actually, that actually have the intent to go to net zero this century. So yeah. So just vigorously agreeing with you, Tom.
Okay, great. As you've said a few times now, Net Zero Tracker is a global initiative. Maybe you'd like to talk about some emerging trends or bright spots in regions or industries that have surprised you.
I mean, I'm guilty, not just the Net Zero Tracker. I'm guilty of not profiling the goodness. I mentioned Volvo Group. They're doing great things on advocacy, and also there's supply chain issues. You've got the likes of Google that are exploring 24/7 renewable energy. A lot of their moves are what we think is counter to climate action in terms of the emissions that are coming from data centers. But you are seeing leadership from the Googles, from the Microsofts. Where else are we seeing leadership? It's one of the usual suspects, but Maersk in the shipping industry. So if we locate organizations and companies that are doing good things in what we call hard to abate or hard to reduce sectors, we should be profiling them above those that are doing the right things in easier to abate or easier to abate sectors. So, I mentioned Google and Microsoft, and they're IT companies, but actually we need to be profiling and surfacing those companies and indeed those regions that are in high emitting nations that are pushing the envelope. And that kind of gets to that ambition loop point that I made earlier. So, yeah, it's not a very satisfactory answer, I don't think, Tom. You've reminded me yet again that I need to go away and look at those that are doing really good things, because we need to be profiling those actors more and more.
Yeah. Yeah, I know it's interesting you mentioned Google and Microsoft, obviously in the tech sector, so easier to decarbonize. But both Google and Microsoft have made separate announcements in the last couple of weeks about reopening mothballed nuclear power plants, or in Google's place, it's about signing a deal with a company that makes these SMRs, the small nuclear reactors, to power their data centers for AI, because I guess AI is hard to abate.
It's inevitable. We are going to pursue AI with gusto. So we do need these innovative solutions. We don't want to fall down the rabbit hole of nuclear, but for me, nuclear is firmly a low carbon technology. And so, this is an and question, not an or. So, you'll pick up my position on nuclear on that, but we need to be doing, and these companies need to be doing everything they can to try and source low carbon energy, because, let's face it, this is inevitable. AI is going to change our world over the next 10, 15 years. One thing I do worry about, there's a few things I do worry about. I said that understanding more about climate change is liberating, but it also reminds you about how difficult the challenge is. So, the rebound effect that some people would be familiar with, our disposition from a collective point of view of using more energy when it becomes cheaper and more readily available. And so it is something I really do worry about. And, we have seen renewables, we have seen energy demand shooting up, and renewables thankfully covering that demand increase, but we do need that demand increase to at least stagnate, so that our renewable deployment can actually start reducing emissions and make that gap wider with energy demand. So yeah, I think I'll leave it there. We don't want to dive too far into those details, especially nuclear.
Yeah. The old Jevons paradox now coming back to bite us in the ass again. And not coal this time, but renewables.
Yeah, exactly.
But looking ahead, what do you think the next big challenge is for countries and companies that have set net zero targets? Are there any key milestones that we should keep an eye on in the next couple of years? I know in the next 5 years we've got 2030 coming, but beyond that or ahead of that?
Yeah, for sure. So firstly, not all net zero targets are created equal. We've touched on that, and we've spoken around the need to look at implementation. We need execution of these targets. I think almost every entity that we track is would have set their target and then being like, okay, how are we going to do this? And that how question of net zero is really, really difficult in a world that still emits 42 billion tons of CO2 plus another 15 billion tons of CO2 equivalent through other greenhouse gases. We need execution if we can, and we need leadership. So countries are looking forward to 2035. So the carbon cutting nationally determined contributions that they're going to be setting next year. And so we talked about how regions and companies look at this, that ceiling of ambition that comes from the national level. So we need governments all over the world, especially key G20 nations, to set ambitious targets, or what sometimes we call stretch goals, because we know that the growth in clean energy, we know that these clean energy innovations increasing rapidly up the S-curve. So we need to bake in some of the projections from the likes of the IEA and Bloomberg New Energy Finance into these national targets for 2035 through these submissions that all countries have promised to do by COP30 next year. And that will then hopefully filter down to the subnational level and the company level, because they will see that ambition, that direction of travel. We are already seeing a proliferation of both policies, so the enabling environment, but also regulation around getting these entities to align with these national net zero targets and especially these interim targets. So we need more of that. We need these stretch goals. We need nations to be ambitious, and we need some domino countries to lead the way.
For listeners who might feel overwhelmed by the scale of the climate challenge, what's an action or actions they can take to help ensure that the net zero targets don't just remain targets, but become reality?
I touched on this earlier, but what I often say is that if an individual action doesn't have political implications or political consequences, it's often better for your conscience than it is for climate. And so I really do stick by that. So the most political thing that any individual can do is to talk about climate change. I'm stealing and plagiarizing from Catherine Hayhoe, probably the best climate change communicator in the world, but it's deeply true. To talk about climate change, you actually first have to understand it. Not in its full glory, but at least at a minimum. So one of the most political things you can do is actually learn about climate change so that you can then speak about it. But yes, you can also do other things. You can join an organization, that's deeply political. You can move careers, again, deeply political. You can go into politics, which is very obviously the most political thing. But yeah, for me, it starts around talking about it. And, that's one of the most encouraging things that I think, looking back over the last 5-10 years, is how many people are talking about this. And yes, we have 8 to 10% of folks out there that still dismiss climate change completely. But we know that about 90% of the population are malleable in terms of shifting their positions on how urgent climate change is. And so, we can speak, if we talk about climate change, we can speak to that 90% and we can help create this movement to just try and achieve these net zero targets more quickly. So yeah, so that would be what I would say. Yeah. Make sure it's political.
Very good. And vote. Make sure to prioritize climate in who you're voting for.
Exactly. And not just voting, but voting with your wallet, of course. So yeah, no, last thing I'd say is I've got a graphic that I haven't yet published yet, but
Cool.
It's looking at your climate shadow. We talked about the spheres of influence, but how can you increase your climate shadow to make an impact, moving from your carbon footprint or your climate footprint to actually your climate shadow? And all the things we just discussed there fit in the shadow.
Nice. You must shoot me a link to that when it goes live. Left field question, John. If you could have any celebrity, fictional character, actual character, alive or dead, to represent the ambitions of the net zero tracker, who would they be and why?
Wow. I think it would be, can I go 2 people?
Sure.
And I'm going to go 2 men, which is a bit controversial, but I'm going to go with Albert Einstein, number 1, because he said, if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand what it is. And so he not only made, push the body of human knowledge into the stratosphere, but he also said it as it is. If you cannot explain it simply, you don't understand it. So that's hugely important for us at the Net Zero Tracker. And for anyone involved in net zero, we're all afflicted by the curse of knowledge. We should try our very, very best to explain stuff simply. The second person I would say would be Stephen Schneider. So the late US climate scientist who said that when it comes to climate change, the 2 least likely outcomes, that it's good for us and that it's going to be the end of the world. And so for me, it's a hugely important message and probably quite a nice one to finish on, Tom, because climate change isn't going to be existential in terms of the end of human civilization, and it's certainly not going to be good for us. But there are a multitude of outcomes in between that, and we need to make sure that we push the best possible outcome we can get to.
John, we're coming towards the end of the podcast now. Is there any question I did not ask that you wish I had, or any aspect of this we haven't touched on that you think it's important for people to be aware of?
I'm going to say I don't think so.
Cool.
I think the point around, what I can do is I can point people to some of my infographics that try and explain climate policy and science in as simple terms as possible, but try not to go too simple so that folks can actually talk about it. And if folks would like to know where they are, I'm happy to give those links over to you, Tom. The Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit hosts a section on infographics explaining complex issues. The Net Zero Tracker has also got a few infographics. So, yeah.
Sure, yeah. That's always my final question. If people would like to know more, where would you have me direct them? So I guess is it ECIU, or you clarify for me where?
Sure. I think ECIU and the Net Zero Tracker. I've got other
I'll,
projects on the sideline, but those two are the most notable for sure.
yeah, shoot me those links. I'll put them in the show notes, and that way everyone will have access to them.
Thanks very much, Tom. Appreciate it.
Yeah, no, thanks to you. Thanks a million for coming on the podcast today. It's been fascinating.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, it'll be great to be on in future when we finally hit net zero.